Have you ever sat alone in the stillness of the night and wondered, what if everything I believed about life, about myself, about the world, was just a veil? Not a mistake, not a lie, but something deeper. A layer so subtle and hidden, we walk through it every single day without ever realizing it's there. This video isn't just another lecture. It's not just a collection of spiritual sayings or a list of Buddhist quotes. It's a mirror. A mirror that will show you something few dare to look at, the truth behind your suffering, the illusion behind your identity, and the answer to the question that haunts us all. If there is no self, then who's born and who dies? This ancient question has echoed for over 2,500 years, since the Buddha sat under the Bodhi tree and shattered the illusion of a permanent me. But make no mistake, this isn't a philosophical riddle. This is about you, your life, your pain, your joy, your fear of death, and your longing for something real. Because what if your endless search for happiness is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what you even are? What if the person you think you are has never truly existed in the way you believe? Now, I know that sounds radical, maybe even unsettling, but stay with me. Because what you're about to hear isn't abstract, it's practical, it's grounded, and it's life-altering. In this journey, you'll uncover the Buddhist teaching of anatta, the profound truth of no self, not as a theory but as a direct experience. You'll understand why clinging to the idea of I, me, and mine is the root of your suffering, and why letting go doesn't mean becoming cold or detached, but becoming free. You'll hear stories. You'll hear reflections from Zen masters, monks, and mystics, and you'll hear the wisdom that modern science is only beginning to confirm. But more than anything, you'll feel something shift inside you. You'll begin to sense, just maybe, that the silence behind your thoughts, the awareness behind your emotions, has always been there, untouched, unbroken, unborn, you beyond the illusion of self. So if you've ever asked, who am I? Why do I suffer? What happens when I die? Then don't just watch this video. Let it reveal you to yourself. Let it challenge what you think is real. And let it offer you the most radical freedom known to humankind. The freedom from the idea of you, because once you see it, once you truly see it, there's no going back. Take a breath, feel it, that stillness. Let's step into it together and begin where all profound truths begin, not in theory but in direct seeing. Have you ever looked back on a moment in your life, one that seemed insignificant at the time, but now realize it changed everything? Maybe it was a random encounter, a missed bus, or a conversation that shifted your path forever. Most of us call it coincidence, fate, luck, but in the language of the Buddha, it is none of those. There is no such thing as random. What you see as chance is just the surface of a much deeper pattern. A web of causes and conditions stretching far beyond what the eye can see. Buddhism calls it karma, a Sanskrit word that simply means action. But don't be fooled by how simple it sounds. This one word carries the weight of countless lifetimes, infinite moments, and every single choice you've ever made. Because karma is not punishment. It's not reward either. Karma is the mirror you cannot escape. Every thought, word, and deed is a thread being woven into the fabric of your future, right now, in this very second. But here's what most people misunderstand. Karma isn't always instant. It doesn't rush to please or punish you. It waits. It watches. And then when the time is just right, when all the conditions ripen, it blooms. Like a seed buried in the soil, it takes water, sunlight, and time before it sprouts. You may forget what you planted, but life doesn't. The universe never loses track. Let's take a moment to visualize this. Imagine a spider's web, delicate yet intricate, stretching across time itself. Every move you make trembles that web. A harsh word here, a kind gesture there, a decision made in anger, an apology whispered in love. Each one sends vibrations into the web, and those vibrations echo, ripple, and eventually return. That's why the Buddha taught, nothing arises without cause. Nothing happens without reason. There is no moment in your life untouched by karma. Not a single one. Every joy, every heartbreak, every struggle. It's not cosmic punishment. It's not life being unfair. It's simply the unfolding of energy you once set in motion. And here's the kicker. Karma doesn't only trace back to this lifetime. It stretches across lifetimes. The burdens you carry, the people you meet, even the talents you were born with, they may all be echoes from a past you no longer remember. Now you might ask, if everything is karma, does that mean my life is fixed? Am I just a puppet of my past? Absolutely not. The law of karma isn't a prison, it's the key to freedom. Because while karma determines the conditions of your life, your response to those conditions is what shapes your future. You can't undo what you've done, but you can stop the chain. Right here, right now. That's the hidden power in all of this. When you understand karma, you no longer react blindly. You pause, you breathe, you choose differently. You become the cause of something better. And slowly, one mindful act at a time, you reshape the destiny you once thought was carved in stone. Let me give you a real example. There was a monk, centuries ago, who was known for his calmness. One day, a man came into his temple and began shouting at him, accusing him of things he didn't do. The monk sat quietly. He didn't argue, he didn't retaliate. When the man finished, the monk looked at him gently and said, "Thank you for coming to deliver the karma I once created. You are free to go now." No anger, no resistance, just understanding. Because the monk knew this man was simply the messenger. The energy he had put out in some forgotten past had come back, wearing a new face. But instead of continuing the cycle, he stopped it, with silence, with compassion. And this is where your true power begins. You see, most of us go through life like victims. Why is this happening to me? We ask. But karma flips that question. It invites you to ask, what am I putting into the world? Because what you put in will return. Not as punishment, but as a reflection. A reflection of the energy you are living from. So if you want love, give it. If you seek peace, be it. If you long for meaning, create it for someone else. The universe is not deaf, it's listening. Always, but remember this, it's not just big things that matter. Karma sees the small things too. The thoughts you repeat when no one's looking. The way you treat a stranger. The gossip you entertain. The compassion you show yourself. All of it is energy. All of it is forming your future. And yet, this truth is not meant to scare you. It's meant to awaken you. Because once you realize that nothing is random, you also realize everything is within your power. You're not a victim of your circumstances, you're their author. You're not helpless in the face of destiny, you're writing it with every breath. So if you're suffering, don't just ask, why me? Ask, what can I do differently from here? That single shift from blame to awareness can change your life, truly, entirely. In the end, karma is not about fear, it's about responsibility. It's the gentle but firm reminder that you matter, that your life is not some accident drifting in a meaningless universe. It's purposeful, it's precise, it's deeply, intricately, lovingly fair. And that should give you hope. Because even if your past was filled with pain, even if your mistakes were many, even if your journey has been heavy, karma is always moving, always changing. And the choices you make today, they will blossom tomorrow. So choose well. The web is always listening. And the life you long for, it's not in some faraway dream. It's already taking shape in the energy you're planting right now. Have you ever noticed how certain people trigger you more than others? How someone's words, even if small, can leave a deep wound, while another's criticism rolls off your back like rain? There's something profound hiding beneath these everyday emotional reactions. It's not just them, it's you. In Buddhism, this truth is echoed in the concept of pratityasamutpada, or interdependent origination. Nothing exists in isolation. And more than that, every relationship you have, every bond you form, every emotional sting or spark is a reflection. A reflection not of who they are, but of who you are inside. Imagine walking through life surrounded by mirrors. Each person you meet holds up a different one. Some show your compassion. Some reveal your hidden anger. Others reflect your jealousy, insecurity, or deep desire to be loved. The people who irritate you the most, they're often shining a light on the parts of you that still need healing. It's uncomfortable, isn't it? To realize that the pain we feel in relationships might be our own shadow speaking. But this is also the doorway to liberation. Think of it like this: when someone makes you feel not enough, what are they really activating inside you? An old wound from childhood, a forgotten voice that once whispered you were unworthy. The Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh often reminded his students, when another person makes you suffer, it is because he suffers deeply within himself and his suffering is spilling over. He does not need punishment, he needs help. Now turn that inward. If you're projecting suffering onto others, if you lash out, judge harshly, or resent deeply, maybe you're the one in pain. And maybe relationships are simply the stage where that pain is asking to be seen. Let me give you a story. There was once a man who kept failing in love. Every partner left him with the same complaint: "You're too controlling. You never trust me." He was heartbroken and blamed them all, until one day, while meditating, a memory surfaced. He remembered his father, a strict man who never let him make a mistake, who always assumed the worst. The man realized he had internalized that mistrust and was projecting it onto every relationship. Not because he wanted to control, but because he feared being abandoned. That awareness changed everything. The moment he saw his pain reflected back at him, he began to heal. He started communicating with more softness, more honesty. And for the first time in his life, he built a lasting, peaceful relationship. This is the power of mirrors, not just for pain, but for growth. If you're surrounded by people who are kind, generous, inspiring, this too is a mirror. It might mean you're cultivating those qualities inside yourself, and life is reflecting them back in the people you now attract. So how do you begin working with this mirror of relationships? Start with radical honesty. The next time someone triggers you, pause, don't react. Instead, ask, what part of me feels threatened? What belief is being challenged? What pain is rising up? This simple inquiry transforms every conflict into a path to self-awareness. Suddenly, you're not a victim of others. You're a student of your own soul. And the beauty is, when you clean your inner mirror, the reflections around you start to shift. Toxic people begin to fall away. Kindred spirits appear. Your outer world becomes a clearer, kinder reflection of your inner peace. Relationships stop being a battlefield. They become a classroom, a sacred place where every trigger is a teacher, every heartbreak a doorway, and every connection, no matter how brief or difficult, an invitation to know yourself more deeply. We don't meet people by accident. Some are tests, some are lessons, some are mirrors, and a few are the medicine we didn't even know we needed. So instead of asking, why is this person treating me this way? Begin asking, what are they trying to show me about myself? Because that's where real wisdom begins. And when you truly understand this, when you stop blaming and start reflecting, you'll find peace in the very places that used to cause your greatest pain. Keep walking with me, because what you're about to discover next is the part of your life story you've probably misunderstood for years. You may have noticed something strange about life. Just when everything feels stable, just when you've finally caught your breath, that's when life throws the next curveball. A sudden illness, the betrayal of someone you trusted, the collapse of a dream you've worked years to build. And yet, what if I told you that this is not punishment, that this is not chaos, nor misfortune, nor something you must escape? What if I told you that this is grace in disguise? In Buddhist wisdom, suffering isn't an enemy. It's a messenger, a teacher, a gatekeeper that stands before the sacred temple of transformation. There's a powerful saying in Zen, "The obstacle is the path." And once you really begin to live from this truth, everything shifts. You stop asking, "Why is this happening to me?" And you begin to ask, "Why is this happening for me?" Suffering in the Buddhist view is not a punishment from some higher being. It is the natural result of clinging to what is impermanent, to who we think we are, to how we think life should go. The first noble truth the Buddha taught was simple, direct, and shocking in its honesty. Life is dukkha. That word dukkha is often translated as suffering, but it's richer than that. It means unease, dissatisfaction, a subtle misalignment with reality. That misalignment is everywhere. When we resist change, when we chase pleasure and avoid pain, when we demand certainty in a world that is constantly shifting like sand under our feet. And yet, it is through this dukkha that awakening begins. Think of a lotus flower. It doesn't bloom in clean, clear water. It grows out of the mud. That dark, thick, suffocating mud is necessary. It nourishes the roots. It gives the lotus something to rise from. Your pain is your mud. Your confusion, your heartbreak, your sense of being lost, they are the very material from which clarity and peace can emerge. Let's take an example from real life. Imagine an elderly man who spent his entire life trying to please others. He worked hard, raised a family, and always put others' needs before his own. On the outside, he was a good person. But deep down, there was resentment, a quiet ache. He had abandoned his own passions. He had never asked what he truly wanted. Then one day after his retirement, his wife passes away suddenly. His children move away, and for the first time he is left completely alone. The loneliness is unbearable. He feels useless, invisible, forgotten. But then something happens. In that silence, in that deep suffering, a question arises. Who am I without anyone else to serve? At first, the question terrifies him, but slowly he begins to explore it. He starts painting again, something he loved as a child but gave up. He begins to walk in the park, to sit under trees, to meditate. He starts reading spiritual books, not to become someone better, but to remember who he's always been. And one morning, while sipping tea and watching the sunrise, tears flow down his cheeks. Not of sadness, but of gratitude. Because he sees it now. Everything that brought him to this moment, the grief, the loneliness, even the regret, was the mud. And now, after 70 years, the lotus begins to bloom. Challenge is not the enemy of peace. It is the doorway to peace. In fact, you will notice that those who have suffered deeply, who have sat with pain instead of running from it, carry a kind of quiet wisdom. They smile more gently. They listen without judging. They do not chase attention because they've made peace with being invisible. Their presence feels like home. Why? Because they have died and been reborn without ever leaving their bodies. And that kind of rebirth only happens in the crucible of suffering. So the next time life challenges you, when someone betrays your trust, when your body begins to age and weaken, when everything you thought you needed falls away, pause. Don't rush to escape the pain. Don't numb it with distraction or drown it in noise. Sit with it. Breathe with it. Listen to it. Because buried within it is a teaching custom-made for your soul. And the more you resist it, the longer you delay your own awakening. Suffering doesn't mean life is broken. It means you are being called. And the ones who answer this call, they begin to see life differently. They stop judging what is good and bad. They begin to honor every experience, not just the joyful, but also the messy, the painful, the bittersweet. Because they've realized something. The deepest growth doesn't come from comfort. It comes from the places you once tried to avoid. And when this insight begins to dawn in your heart, a strange thing happens. You begin to see others differently too. You stop labeling people as difficult or toxic. Because suddenly you see them not as problems, but as mirrors, reflecting your deepest lessons. Let's explore this truth more deeply. You've probably heard the phrase, "let it go," tossed around casually, as if it were as easy as setting down a cup of coffee. But what if I told you that letting go isn't weakness? It's spiritual mastery. That surrender isn't defeat. It's alignment with the very rhythm of the universe. Because everything you've clung to, every expectation, identity, relationship, every illusion of permanence, it was never really yours to begin with. In the teachings of the Buddha, impermanence, anicca, isn't just a concept. It is the very heartbeat of reality. Everything arises, exists for a time, and then fades away. Seasons change, bodies age, loved ones leave, plans fail. Joy passes, sorrow fades. And when we resist this natural cycle, when we grasp, hold tight, and refuse to release, we suffer. But if you can learn to flow with this law, like a leaf riding a river, then life becomes less of a struggle and more of a sacred dance. Letting go begins the moment you stop fighting what is. We often think of letting go as giving something up, a dream, a person, a past version of ourselves, and that seems painful, doesn't it? But what if letting go isn't about losing, it's about freeing? It's the act of clearing space for something more aligned to come in. Think of a tree in autumn. Its leaves don't cling in fear of falling. They surrender with grace, becoming nourishment for new growth. The tree doesn't mourn the loss, it trusts the cycle. In the same way, letting go is a sacred trust, a faith that whatever leaves your life is not punishment, it's preparation. The clearing of a path for what's meant for your soul's highest evolution. Many people hold on because of fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of emptiness, fear of being left with nothing. But here's the truth. The void you fear is not empty. It's full of possibility. Only when your hands are empty can you truly receive. There's an old Zen story of a student who comes to a wise master, asking to learn the path to enlightenment. The master serves him tea. He pours the tea until it overflows. The student shouts, "Stop, it's already full." The master replies, "Exactly. Like this cup, you are full of your own opinions, attachments, and ego. How can I teach you unless you empty your cup?" Letting go is the emptying of the cup. It's releasing the stories you tell yourself about how life should be. It's releasing the roles you've outgrown, the guilt you carry, the illusions that cage you. But letting go doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you stop trying to control what's beyond you. You still love deeply, but without trying to possess. You still strive, but without clinging to outcome. You still feel, but without resisting the tides of joy and pain. In Buddhism, clinging is one of the roots of suffering. Tanha, craving, keeps the wheel of samsara turning. We crave pleasure, permanence, control, validation. And because none of these are stable, we're constantly thrown into dissatisfaction. Letting go, then, is a radical act. It's saying, I will no longer let my peace depend on external conditions. I choose presence over possession. I choose flow over fear. When you begin to let go, you may feel like you're losing yourself. That's natural, because for so long we've mistaken our attachments for our identity. But the truth is, who you are is not what you own, not what you achieve, not who you're with, and not even who you were yesterday. Who you are is the awareness behind all of it, the spacious sky behind the passing clouds. Think about all the times life forced you to let go. A job ended, a relationship dissolved, a dream shattered. And in the moment, it felt like ruin. But looking back, can you see how much lighter you became? How much freer? How much closer to your truth? Letting go doesn't always come gently. Sometimes it rips away what no longer serves you. Sometimes it cracks you open, but those cracks let in the light. And the more you surrender, the less life has to take things from you by force. You begin to participate in the unfolding, not resist it. Start small. Let go of one expectation, one grudge, one limiting belief. Even letting go of the need to always be right can set your spirit free in ways you never imagined. Let go of the idea that you are behind in life. You are not late. You are not broken. You are not failing. You are simply unfolding at the pace of your own awakening. And if you've ever feared that letting go means forgetting, remember this: you can let go without erasing the love. Letting go doesn't mean your memories vanish. It means they no longer control you. They no longer chain you to the past. You carry their wisdom, but you no longer carry their weight. The greatest peace is not found in clinging. It's found in release. So breathe, open your hands, and trust that the current of impermanence is not here to drown you. It's here to carry you exactly where you're meant to be. Because only when you let go can you finally be free. And when you begin to feel that freedom, not the fleeting kind that comes from achievement, but the deep, abiding peace that arises when you're no longer resisting life, then you're ready to step into one of the most powerful realizations of all. That even the challenges you once feared are here to help you. Let's look deeper. Have you ever met someone for the first time, yet felt like you've known them forever? There's an uncanny familiarity, an unspoken understanding, a feeling that defies logic. Maybe it was a brief encounter, or perhaps it's someone who's become a central part of your life. But something about them feels ancient, like you've danced through lifetimes together. In Buddhism, this isn't just poetic, it's karmic. These inexplicable connections are often echoes from past lives, threads woven through time, binding souls in silent recognition. They're not accidents, they're appointments, scheduled long before your birth. And they arrive to teach, heal, or even test you. Karma, in its deepest sense, is not about punishment or reward. It's memory, the memory of your consciousness across lifetimes. Your soul doesn't forget. When you come across a person who triggers intense emotion, love, fear, anger, protection, it's often because of unfinished karmic threads. Perhaps in another life they were your parent, your enemy, your teacher, or your child. The story has changed, the costumes are different, but the emotional imprint remains. You're not starting from zero. You're continuing something that never really ended. Imagine your soul like a traveler on a great pilgrimage. With each life, it picks up certain impressions, certain lessons. And with each connection, it carries baggage or blessings from what was before. This explains why some relationships feel faded, while others seem to come and go with barely a ripple. But here's the profound truth. Karma is not just something happening to you, it's something you're co-creating moment by moment. When you respond with compassion rather than resentment, when you forgive instead of hold on, when you let go rather than grasp, you're not only healing this life, but countless lifetimes behind and ahead. You're rewriting your soul's future. That's why certain relationships feel so intense. They're not meant to be easy. They're meant to be transforming. They exist to awaken something dormant within you, to invite you back to your center, to test your ego, to open your heart wider than it's ever been. Even pain has purpose. You might have a partner who betrays you, not to destroy you, but to push you towards self-respect. A friend may abandon you, not to punish you, but to show you that your worth isn't dependent on anyone's presence. Or maybe a stranger offers you a moment of unexpected kindness that shifts the entire course of your day and unknowingly balances a karmic debt from another life. When you begin to see life this way, nothing is wasted. Every connection, every rupture, every meeting becomes sacred. Some souls travel with you over and over again. They are your karmic companions. They appear in your story wearing different faces, but their essence remains. They come back to help you evolve, and you do the same for them. This is why forgiveness is so vital in Buddhist practice, because resentment ties you to karmic cycles, but forgiveness frees you, not just now, but across lifetimes. So the next time someone enters your life and shakes you at the core, pause. Don't just ask, "Why is this happening?" Ask, "What is this soul here to remind me?" Because beneath the surface of everyday life, there's a karmic river flowing, pulling us toward the people we need the most, not for comfort, but for awakening. And often, our deepest soul work lies not in isolation, but in the mirror of another's eyes. Even if they break you, even if they leave, even if they don't stay long, they came for a reason, and so did you. Your journey through these sacred connections is far from over. In fact, you're just beginning to remember. Because beneath every relationship, every hello, every goodbye, there is a cosmic truth humming quietly. We never really meet by chance. Now, what happens when life pulls everything away, when you lose what you thought was forever? That's when impermanence begins to teach its most beautiful and brutal lesson. Let's open that door. Sometimes we think relationships are just about companionship, love, or support. But what if they are something far more profound? What if the person you're with is just your partner, your friend, or your family member, but a mirror, a teacher, a sacred key unlocking the doors of your own spiritual awakening? In Buddhism, we don't see relationships merely as emotional attachments. We view them as sacred grounds, terrains of practice, and every person who walks into your life comes with a purpose, not always to stay, not always to comfort, but often to shake something awake within you. You see, the Buddha never taught that isolation was the only path to enlightenment. Even he walked through this life surrounded by disciples, tested by enemies, and deeply connected to the people around him. It is within these interactions, the friction, the love, the hurt, and the healing, that we are pushed to grow beyond our limitations. Have you ever noticed how a certain relationship brings out the best in you or the worst? That's not random. That's not just chemistry. That is karma inviting you to see what lies dormant inside you, both your light and your shadow. It's easy to be calm when you're alone on a mountain. But when you're misunderstood, ignored, or criticized by someone you love, that's when the real test begins. And it's in that moment you're invited into awakening. In the Zen tradition, there's a saying, "Before enlightenment, chop wood and carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood and carry water." But here's what they don't often say. It's the way you treat the people who hand you the axe and the bucket that reveals the depth of your practice. When you feel triggered in a relationship, pause, breathe, look within. Instead of reacting, ask, "What is this trying to teach me? What part of me is wounded? What belief am I clinging to?" Most of the time, it's not the other person. It's the old story you've been carrying for years, maybe lifetimes. And the relationship is merely the flashlight illuminating it. Romantic partners especially have this sacred role. They enter our lives and immediately press buttons we didn't even know existed. Why? Because they come close enough to reach them. They remind us where we feel unworthy, insecure, abandoned, or unseen. But if we're willing to stay conscious, those moments of pain become the exact places where we grow, where we stop projecting and start taking ownership. You begin to understand, this person isn't here to save me. They're here to reflect me. And through that reflection, I begin to awaken. One of the most beautiful lessons in Buddhism is interbeing, the truth that we are not separate from anyone or anything. Every relationship is a dance of interconnection. When someone hurts you, your reaction reveals your inner attachments. When someone loves you, your openness reveals your trust in life. And when someone leaves, your ability to let go shows your freedom. This is why monks in monasteries often live in community, not just to meditate together, but to irritate, challenge, and support each other on the path. Because every human interaction is a chance to either contract or awaken. So ask yourself, what relationships in your life are awakening you right now? Which ones challenge your ego? Which ones open your heart? Which ones make you more mindful, more patient, more forgiving? Don't run from them. Don't label them as toxic too quickly. Look again. That difficult person may be your best teacher. That heartbreak may be your greatest liberation. That unspoken tension may be the beginning of your most honest self. Buddhist master Thich Nhat Hanh said, "The next Buddha may not take the form of a person. The next Buddha may take the form of a relationship." So treat every connection as sacred. Approach it with presence. See it as an invitation. Because through the doorway of the relationship, the path to awakening reveals itself. Have you ever looked at someone in your life and thought, why is this relationship so difficult? Why do we keep triggering each other? Or perhaps you've wondered, why do I keep attracting the same type of people? Why does the same story keep repeating? The truth is, we often approach relationships like they're something to be fixed, controlled, or escaped. But from the lens of Zen and Buddhist insight, relationships aren't puzzles to be solved. They're portals to transformation. To truly evolve, we don't always need more information. We need practice. That's why in this chapter, we turn to 4 essential Buddhist practices that can transform the way we relate to others, whether it's your partner, parent, child, friend, or even your harshest critic. These aren't techniques to win in relationships. They are timeless practices to help you grow through them. Let's begin. 1. Deep listening without the need to fix or respond. In the Zen tradition, listening is considered an act of love. Not the kind of listening where you wait for your turn to speak, but the kind of presence where you listen with your whole being, without judgment, without defensiveness. When someone speaks to you, especially in conflict, can you drop your inner dialogue, your urge to fix, your opinions? Can you simply be there? Thich Nhat letter 1ea5t, H letter 1ea1nh called this compassionate listening. He taught that when we listen deeply to someone's suffering, we offer them relief, even if we say nothing at all. Think about the last time you felt truly heard. What if you gave that same experience to someone else? That in itself could transform the entire relationship. 2. Right speech, using words as medicine. In Buddhism, there's a precept known as right speech. It doesn't mean being polite or sugarcoating the truth. It means speaking in ways that are true, timely, and kind, words that uplift rather than harm. Imagine if every word you spoke carried a karmic ripple. What would change in how you communicate? Here's a small but powerful practice. Before you speak, ask yourself these 4 questions. Is it true? Is it necessary? Is it kind? Is it the right time? Most arguments, cold wars, or emotional damage arise not from what was said, but how it was said. But words, when chosen with awareness, can heal. In fact, the Buddha once said, "Better than 1,000 hollow words is one word that brings peace." 3. Seeing the other as yourself, the mirror of oneness. In the Avatamsaka Sutra, there's a striking teaching. When one sees others as not separate from oneself, compassion arises spontaneously. In practical terms, that person who annoys you, that's your impatience. That one who always needs control, that's your fear reflected. That friend who inspires you, that's your potential waiting to bloom. Everyone you meet is showing you something about you. This practice isn't just spiritual fluff, it's a tool for radical responsibility. Whenever you feel reactive, pause and ask, what part of me is being shown here? You'll often find that the healing lies not in changing the other, but in integrating a part of yourself that you've forgotten, rejected, or denied. 4. Loving kindness, metta, a daily practice of inner softening. Metta, or loving kindness meditation, is perhaps one of the most beautiful practices in the Buddhist tradition. It's not just about feeling love, it's about generating sincere goodwill toward all beings, even those who have hurt us. You begin by offering it to yourself. May I be safe. May I be happy. May I be healthy. May I live with ease. Then to someone you love. Then to someone neutral. Then to someone difficult. And finally to all beings. This practice doesn't mean tolerating abuse or bypassing boundaries. It means softening the armor we carry, releasing the weight of grudges, expectations, and silent wars we hold within. One practitioner said, "When I began metta practice, I thought I was sending love to others, but I was really melting the ice around my own heart." So these are the 4 keys: deep listening, right speech, seeing the other as yourself, and loving kindness. They are simple in words, but profound in impact. They won't solve every conflict or make everyone love you, but they will open a new dimension of relating, one that's based not on ego but on awareness, not on fear but on compassion. And most importantly, they allow relationships to become what they were always meant to be, not distractions on the path, but the very path itself. Because when we practice in the midst of real connection, that's when transformation stops being a theory and becomes your lived truth. Now that we've explored the practices that can reshape how we relate to others, let's go even deeper into the mysterious bonds we feel with certain people, the kind that defies logic, distance, or time. Sometimes the most powerful truths are not found in scriptures or scholarly debate, but in the quiet unfolding of ordinary lives. In this chapter, we enter sacred space, the realm of real stories. These are not tales for entertainment. They are living examples of karma in motion, reminders that every encounter is an echo, every wound an invitation, and every reconciliation a small enlightenment. Let me tell you the story of Maya. She was a nurse in her mid-40s, respected for her compassion, yet tormented by an inner loneliness she could never explain. Every romantic relationship she entered ended the same way, abruptly, painfully, without clear reason. One day, during a silent meditation retreat, she was overwhelmed by an inexplicable flood of grief. In a vision-like dream that night, she saw herself in ancient robes, turning away from a man begging her not to leave. The pain in his eyes was unbearable. When she awoke, tears wet her pillow. She didn't know if it was imagination or memory, but her heart knew it was real. What changed wasn't the past, it was her present. She stopped seeking someone to complete her. She began practicing metta, loving kindness meditation, especially for those she once resented. Within a year, her relationships shifted. She met a gentle man who, unlike the others, stayed. And more importantly, she didn't push him away. It wasn't luck. It was karmic healing. You see, karma isn't just a cosmic scoreboard, it's a teacher. It doesn't punish, it reveals. And when we understand it, we can respond, not with guilt or fear, but with courage and compassion. Another story. A man named Daniel came to a Zen monastery after losing his son in a car accident. He was consumed by guilt because they had argued the night before. He thought karma was punishing him. But the abbot said something that pierced his despair. Karma is not a judge. It's a mirror. It shows us where we are not yet free. Through months of meditation and daily service to others, Daniel's pain softened. He realized that his suffering wasn't just about the loss. It was also about the self-blame that chained his heart. The abbot guided him through Tonglen, a Tibetan practice of breathing in the suffering of others and breathing out healing. Eventually, Daniel began leading support groups for grieving parents. His wound became a window for others to find light. And isn't that the deepest form of healing? When our own transformation helps someone else rise, not all karma is heavy. Some is mysteriously beautiful. There was once a woman named Arya who met an elderly Japanese monk while traveling. They spoke only briefly, yet both felt a familiarity beyond time. Before parting, the monk whispered, "We practiced together before, in another life," and smiled. Arya wept for hours, not knowing why. That brief connection reawakened her dedication to the Dharma, something she had abandoned for years. Not all karmic meetings are meant to last. Some are meant to ignite. Karma doesn't always unfold in this lifetime. Sometimes, we are merely the harvesters of seeds we did not plant. Other times, we are the gardeners sowing what we may never live to reap. But in either case, we are always participating in the sacred continuity of cause and effect. So, when someone hurts you deeply, don't rush to revenge. Step back. Ask, what is this showing me about myself? Where is the wound that seeks healing? What soul contract may we be fulfilling? These are not easy questions, but they're the only ones that free you from the karmic wheel. We must remember, karma doesn't mean you deserve your suffering. It means there's a teaching hidden within it. When seen with clarity and met with compassion, karma becomes the path, not the punishment. And through each act of understanding, forgiveness, and conscious love, we rewrite our karmic story. We become not just characters, but authors. And when enough of us do this, the entire world begins to heal. There's still one final thread to weave in this tapestry, a gentle closing to this profound journey. Let's continue. Take a breath. Feel the rise and fall of your chest. Notice the quiet space between your thoughts. That space, the one that has watched every joy, every wound, every meeting and goodbye, that is where your freedom lives. We've traveled far together. You've seen that nothing in your life is random. Every person who entered, gentle or harsh, healing or heartbreaking, was part of a web of causes and conditions, a karmic tapestry woven with exquisite precision. You've seen how relationships aren't just stories of love and loss, they're mirrors, teachers, doorways. You've learned that suffering isn't a curse, it's the mud that grows the lotus. That impermanence isn't cruelty, it's the rhythm that keeps your heart soft, awake, and free. And maybe, just maybe, you've begun to feel what the sages have whispered for millennia. That awakening doesn't only bloom on a mountain or on a cushion. It happens in the middle of your life, inside every hello, every argument, every silent goodbye. So, as we close this journey, carry these simple truths with you. 1. No meeting is meaningless. If someone is in your life, even briefly, they carry a message. Ask, what is this here to teach me? Let curiosity replace resentment. Let wisdom replace blame. 2. People are mirrors. When you are triggered, pause, look inward, ask, what part of me is reflected here? The moment you see the wound, you stop making others responsible for it. That's the moment you begin to heal. 3. Pain is a portal, not a prison. When life breaks you open, don't rush to shut down. Breathe. Listen, bow to the lesson. Let the old self dissolve, let the truer self emerge. 4. Everything changes. Hold gently, love fully, release gracefully. Letting go doesn't mean you stop caring, it means you stop clinging. You honor the flow of life instead of fighting it. 5. Practice, practice, practice. Deep listening, right speech, seeing the other as yourself. Metta, loving kindness for all beings, including the one wearing your name. These are not ideas to admire. They are paths to walk every day. Now let's seal this with a living practice. Close your eyes if you can. Place a hand over your heart. Silently repeat, may I be safe. May I be peaceful. May I see clearly. May I live with an open heart. Now bring to mind someone you love. May you be safe. May you be peaceful. May you see clearly. May you live with an open heart. Now someone you feel neutral toward. And now someone who challenges you. Let your heart widen wider and wider still, until it holds all beings everywhere, seen and unseen, past and future, friend and stranger, human and more than human. May all beings be safe. May all beings be peaceful. May all beings see clearly. May all beings live with open hearts. Feel the stillness again. This path you're on, it's sacred, not because it's perfect, not because it's easy, but because you're walking it with awareness, with courage, with gratitude. So walk gently with those you love, with those who hurt you, with the parts of yourself that are still learning how to soften. Forgive freely, not to erase the past, but to free your future. And remember, every moment you choose compassion over contraction, presence over reaction, truth over ego, you're not just changing your life. You're changing your karma. You're changing the field we all share. Let gratitude be the lamp you carry. Gratitude for the teachers who came in beautiful forms. Gratitude for the teachers who came in difficult forms. Gratitude for the breath you're taking right now. Gratitude for the awareness that's hearing these words, the timeless witness that was never born and will never die. When you leave this video, don't leave the practice. Let your next conversation be your meditation cushion. Let your next conflict be your monastery. Let the next person you meet on the street, online, in your home, be the next Buddha you bow to. Because truly, no one crosses your path by accident. Nothing is random. And everything is guiding you home. Walk on with grace. And when it's hard, pause, breathe, and remember, the obstacle is the path. The relationship is the teacher. The letting go is the liberation. And the gratitude is the light you walk by.